A warm welcome from the Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades. My name is Mohamed Amjahid. I'm an investigative freelance reporter and book author from Germany with the privilege to be a fellow here in the lovely Thomas Mann House and the even bigger privilege to be able to talk to Peter Jelavich about a very, very important topic. First, I would ask you, Peter, maybe to introduce yourself and tell us why we are here today.
Okay, I'm delighted to be here today with you, Mo, in the Thomas Mann House. I'm a professor of history at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. My teaching field is modern European intellectual and cultural history since the Enlightenment. My research field is German as well as German-Jewish cultural history from the late 19th century to the present. And I'm also currently affiliated with the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Technical University in Berlin. And it's precisely that topic, anti-Semitism, which brings us here today. Not just anti-Semitism, but racism in general. And one of the issues we want to focus on has to do with this situation, which I can probably describe in 3 steps. The first step is that anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Semitic incidents have increased tremendously in the United States and in Europe over the past few years. And it's coming from various directions. Just think about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, where the chant was, "Jews will not replace us." A year later, 11 parishioners were murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, again by a white nationalist. The year after that, 2 African Americanists killed 3 people in a kosher supermarket in Jersey City. And just to jump to the present, in January, a British citizen of Pakistani descent held 3 people hostage in a synagogue outside of Dallas. Those are just the high points of what's going on. All of them have to do with anti-Semitism coming from 3 different directions. The second point I'd like to make, though, is, of course, it's not just anti-Semitism that's increasing, it's racism in general. But the problem, and this is why we're here today, is that there is a large anti-racist movement. There is an anti-racist rhetoric and discourse, but Jews are often excluded from it. And the Jewish communities are very well aware of it. Books have come out about it. Most recently, David Baddiel, British comedian, came out with a book last year saying, "Jews don't count," how identity politics failed one particular identity. So for some reason, among certain groups of so-called leftists and so-called progressives, anti-Semitism is not taken seriously. And the third point to make, to try to explain this, is that the problem is that Jews are often conflated with the notion of whiteness. A notion of whiteness which says if you are white, you cannot be subjected to racist discrimination. And that's the problem. Because one point I'd like to make is that you can enjoy a lot of what's called white privilege and still be subject to racist attacks. And Jews, but not just Jews, are precisely in this category.
Exactly. And what I'm trying to focus on as a book author is actually the construction of whiteness. Whiteness and race, they don't make any sense. Some people just came up with it. So for me, it's interesting to understand how whiteness was invented and reinvented to exclude or include some communities or minorities. And what I'm doing here in the Thomas Mann House, I'm looking at the intersection actually of political discourse and entertainment. It's like Los Angeles is the best place to do that. And I don't know if you know the series Sex and the City. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know Sex and the City, please read up. It's a classic series from the 90s and the 2000s about 4 rich women, actually, and now they had a reboot. And one criticism was that this series actually is too white. And I'm particularly interested in the character of Charlotte. Charlotte is a white woman who married a Jewish man and converted to Judaism. Conversion, that's another topic, actually. We can talk about maybe next time. But I find it very interesting how in the series this character is sometimes portrayed as white and sometimes portrayed as Jewish. It's very interesting to see in the new reboot that Charlotte is trying to have a new friend, a black friend, because it's 2022, and she's afraid to reveal that her only friend would be that black friend, actually, her only black friend in her friend zone. So the punchline is actually that then Charlotte gets invited to her black friend's home and discovers that she's the only white friend there. A couple of episodes later, the whole series is evolving around the fact that they have a bat mitzvah. So it's not anymore the white person talking, it's the Jewish person talking. And there you can see that whiteness actually is constructed however you want a narrative to go. It doesn't make sense often. And this is why I think a lot of progressive and leftist communities, they get also confused when they talk about anti-racism, and they don't think about Jewish voices, or they exclude them, or of course you also have anti-Semitic views within progressive communities.
Right, and there is a lot of confusion, and maybe later on in our discussion, I don't want to give a historical lecture, even though that's what I do for a living. What little money I make, talking about such things at length. But there are reasons why Jews were not considered white at a certain point, and then were considered white after a certain point. But just to show the confusion today, the confusion is actually in the United States policy. According to the census, there are basically 5 major groups. You can be white, what used to be called Caucasian, African American or of African descent, Asian or of Asian descent, Indigenous American. And as a subgroup of white, you have Hispanics, who used to be considered white, and then because of the obvious problems that Hispanics face in America, they became a separate category, but still under white. Now, how is white defined? White is defined as anybody of European ancestry or of the Mediterranean basin, which means that according to census definition, both Jews and Arabs are white in the United States. This whole question of whiteness is an American problem.
Yes.
Now, so that's on the one hand, Jews and Arabs are white according to the census. But there were some very interesting cases that made it to the Supreme Court into the 1980s. And they all have to do with civil rights legislation dating back to the immediate Civil War period, when all sorts of laws were passed to protect especially blacks, but basically any racial group that was discriminated against, so that you could get brought before federal courts for infringing upon federal laws against hateful acts based upon your ancestry. The assumption was that if you are white, you are not protected by these laws. So what happens in the 1980s? Well, the first case was a professor of Iraqi background who didn't get tenure at a Catholic college. So he sued them in federal court saying, you're discriminating me against an Arab. The Catholic college said, well, this is not discrimination because you're Arab, you're white. You can't discriminate against a white. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finessed the issue by saying, when that law was passed in 1866, Arabs were not considered white. They were a separate race. And so therefore they're a protected category. A few years later, same thing happened. A white person smeared graffiti on a synagogue in Maryland. They sued him for a racial attack. He said, well, look, you Jews are white, I'm white, this is not racism. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, Jews are a protected category according to the 1866 law, because even though Jews are considered white now, they're not considered white then. Why these details? It's because on the one hand, according to census, Jews and Arabs are white, but according to hate speech, hate laws, discrimination laws, Jews and Arabs can be considered not white for the purpose of suing for racial discrimination. that's the confusion is there in the law itself.
And the conflict actually also in the political discourse. Preparing for this conversation, we were talking about also the construction of the ultimative other. If you have a look to US history, it might be very, very clear that the ultimative other in this country, these are Black people actually, because the society wanted to argue why it's okay to dehumanize and enslave Black people. If you look into European history, the ultimative other would be the Jewish community. Everything what's Jewish is not compatible with our Christian, white supremacist culture. So for me also, it's interesting how these two historical views blend together actually in a world where, of course, you have a lot of exchange and you have social media and you have actually very complicated biographies also. It's true that a lot of Jewish individuals in the US are white passing. There is a difference between being white and white passing and profiting from white privilege, even though you are, for example, Jewish. So you have a lot of people from Jewish communities being white passing. That doesn't mean that all Jews are white at the same time, especially when you actually migrate, your positionality also is a different positionality. If you are like a Jewish person, I would argue in Germany, it makes a difference if you are in Germany or if you go and travel to the US.
Yeah, and I want to, about, are Jews white? Most Jews in the United States can be considered white and do enjoy many forms of white privilege. But that's not a global phenomenon. If you look at Israel, at most 30% of Jewish citizens of Israel can be considered white. 70% of Jewish citizens of Israel, by any definition of people of color, are people of color. That is, they're Sephardic, they're Mizrahi, or they otherwise have African or Asian ancestry. Geographical ancestry, I mean. And so in Israel itself, Jews cannot be called white. Now, let's get back to your point, which is very important. There are two different dynamics going on in Europe and the United States, and that's why this is a transatlantic dialogue that we're having. In Europe, for centuries, Jews were the ultimate other. They are the ultimate other. In Christian Europe, they were the ultimate other in religious terms. In the 19th century, you have the rise of nationalism. Nation states are formed. But Jews are never considered fully German citizens or Italian citizens or Polish citizens. They might have the rights of citizenship, but they are not considered fully parts of the nation by German, Italian, and other nationalists. And then you've got the third thing coming along, which is the racism of Europe starting in the late 19th century, where it's Aryans against Jews. So Jews, whether it's Christians against Jews, the nation state against Jews, national identity against Jews, or the Aryan race against Jews, Jews are always the ultimate point against which everything else defines itself. What's interesting is that when Jews then, because of this situation, emigrate to the United States looking for a better life, they encounter a totally different dynamic, which has nothing to do with Jewish history. It's never been seen in the, 3,500 years of Jewish history, namely white and black. And as you said, the United States is defined racially in terms of black being the ultimate other, against which everything gets defined. And it's a category from which they cannot break out. So how did Jews deal with this?
Yeah, it's so powerful that when I go back and read, for example, how Jews tried to deal with this, with assimilation, for example, giving up names, giving up religion, giving up all the whole culture, yet they ended up being killed in the Holocaust. You would have entire families being Christian, actually, and being better Christians than any German Christian, original Christian back then. And it's so powerful to be subject to this othering, actually, that you cannot shake it off. It's even like if you go and try to be even more German than any other German, you will be the Jewish person, and they will track you down. And even like I said that there is something like white passing. And I was very shocked when I was in Budapest with a Jewish friend of mine from Hungary. And we were just minding our own business, actually. And you would say if like a Jewish person does not reflect its culture or religion in how the person dresses, for example, or speaks, you would say white passing means you would not recognize that person as Jewish. But that night there was this Hungarian Nazi, and he actually looked at us and he pointed at my friend and he said, "Jido." So I'm like, this is how powerful actually this othering works. That some radicalized communities, people, white supremacists, they are trained. I don't know how a Jew looks actually, but they are trained to, to be suspicious and always look for the danger. So this is how much Jewish communities cannot hide actually from being othered and being discriminated at in majority white countries.
Yeah, and many Jews, especially of Ashkenazi background, can pass as white as long as they don't wear any signs of Judaism. But once you put on a kippah, or once, if you're Orthodox, of course, you're going to have a lot more accoutrements of Jewishness. No matter what your skin tone is, or your physiognomy, that's going to, make you a Jew. And so that's why even in Berlin for the last 5 or 6 years or so, there's a real discussion among the Jewish community, should you wear a kippah in public? Because if you do, the chances are pretty good, well, fairly good, who knows, you might get attacked.
At the same time, should you wear a kippah is a very interesting question in a very Christian normative country, because as I see it, or I read, it's very easy to be Christian and you don't need to wear the cross, for example. But for some Orthodox Jewish people or also Muslims, it is a difference actually, because your religion actually marks you as a member of that certain religion. You need to wear a wig or you need to wear the kippah. It depends on which, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You have like a lot of possibilities to live your religion. But it's the same thing for Muslims, actually, if you think about the headscarf. So sometimes there's even not the option for a lot of people to be in disguise and say, I'll try to be outside and not be marked as member of that religion.
It's only an option for Jews or Muslims who are not especially religious.
Yeah.
That's, or you couldn't be like, Reform and don't have to wear it. But if you're parts of conservative or Orthodox Jewish, you have to wear these marks. And so it's really actually for them not a choice about whether to pass or not.
Yeah, and now we were talking about security issues, but there is like a big discussion in Germany about neutrality, actually, in some institutions like schools or university, where they are asking individuals to not wear religious symbols, which is easy, actually, for someone who doesn't have an orthodox way to live their religion. It's like
it's easy
Luther
for Christians.
Yeah,
it's like for Christians it's easy.
It's easy, So
and
this
that's
is
why it's Christian normative.
It's Christian normative. The Neutralitätsgesetz actually is targeting especially Muslim women in this case, and who is actually also dragged into this conversation are Jews. But no one was thinking about that. The same thing with the circumcision debate 10 years ago, where some right-wing commentators, let's say, and politicians, they wanted to ban the circumcision of boys. They were thinking about Muslims, actually. And there, something very interesting happened, that you had a very strong allyship between Jewish and Muslim communities in fighting back this attempt to actually, at the end, forbid the religion itself.
Right. And they actually got a lot of support. These Jewish and Muslim communities got a lot of support from the CDU and also Angela Merkel, because they realized this is an attack on religion. And
in context of German history.
in the context of German history, and even back then, I mean, I was totally shocked by that proposal, because what it would have meant is that you no longer could have had a Jewish community in Germany. And about the Jewish community, there was the phrase, this is Holocaust without gas chambers. If you ban male circumcision, then you can no longer have a Jewish community. It's the easy way of getting rid of all your Jews. And as I think you said, this law was aimed against Muslims, but the effect would have been to eradicate Judaism as well, which is why it didn't get anywhere.
This is why I argue often that being member of a vulnerable community or minority and being racist or anti-Semitic at the same time, that doesn't make any sense, actually, for your own security. Because it sounds a little bit, pathetic Disney, but if we don't protect each other, there's no one else who will protect us. And this is why it's very stupid to be Muslim or Black and be anti-Semitic, or be Jewish and be racist. Because you have this kind of situations where you find a lot of racism within Jewish communities, or, for example, anti-Semitism within Black communities or communities of color. And if you trace it, at least when I do my research and I trace the problem, it always goes back to white supremacy, or often goes back to white supremacy. There is a very interesting essay written by James Baldwin trying to understand anti-Semitism within Black communities. It's called Black People Are Anti-Semitic Because They Are Anti-White, actually. And there you can see how Baldwin tries to trace that phenomenon, that you would find a lot of anti-Semitism. It's sometimes twice as high, for example, compared to white communities, to understand where is this coming from, actually.
The Baldwin essay is very important, very crucial. I'd like to try to explain how one got to the point where he writes an essay like that in the 1960s. But I think one of the reasons we are here is what you said, that Jews and Blacks have to stay united. There's been a lot of separation between them, which I want to get to, the reasons why that might have happened. But you mentioned white supremacy. And it's very important to realize that white supremacy, and the white supremacists are the people who are proud to be white, who are self-conscious about what they think whiteness is. Every white supremacist is figuratively or literally carrying a two-barreled shotgun. One of those barrels is aimed at Blacks, and the other one is aimed at Jews. And that's why you had, in 2015, 9 parishioners of an African-American church in Atlanta killed by a white supremacist. That's why 3 years later, you have 11 members of a synagogue in Pittsburgh killed by a white supremacist. Now, white supremacists, they're against other groups as well, but their main targets are Blacks and Jews. Now, that having happened, why is there this division between the two? So let's look at a bit of history. Jews are not an issue in American history up until the post-Civil War period, because there are hardly any of them. And they keep to themselves. They don't intermarry. They have all the rights of whiteness. They can vote. They have rights of citizenship, but there are hardly any. What you have is, from the 1880s on, because of pogroms in Russia, a whole flood of Russian and other East European Jews coming to the United States. And then the question becomes, are they white or are they not? Now, they come to the United States, and this whole issue of white and Black, it means nothing to them. They've never faced this. So they're struggling to get a foothold in the United States. Many of them, if they're working class, go into the garment industry. Why the garment industry? Because other trade unions will not accept them. That is, Jews at the turn of the century, 1900, cannot become carpenters, cannot become plumbers, cannot go into the transport industry. I can list a whole bunch of it, because the trade unions are anti-Semitic. And so if you're working class, you go into that. If you set up your own shop, what do? A lot of them set up shop in Black communities. That is, they found grocery stores, they found pawn shops, all sorts of stores in the Black community, because they don't Whites will not do that. Whites want to stay away from the black community. Jews have no problem with that. You also have, when you get to the Yiddish press and the radical Yiddish press, people see that there is a real similarity between pogroms and lynching. So there's also a feeling of solidarity there. That's why a lot of the support for the Scottsboro Boys, by the time you get to the 1930s, is coming from the Jewish community. That's why when you get to the civil rights movement of the 1950s, a lot of support for black civil rights comes to the Jewish community. That's why by the time you get to the Freedom Summer of 1964, one half of the so-called whites going south to help blacks are Jewish. 2 of the 3 people killed in the summer of 64 are Jewish. The other one is African American. So you've got, and just to sort of top it off institutionally, and I think it was 1909, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is founded supposedly as an interracial organization, whites and blacks, but it's not white, it's Jews and blacks.
Yeah.
And in fact, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th presidents of the NAACP were Jewish. Between the 1920s and 1975, the NAACP had Jewish presidents. So there's this real tight alliance. That being the case, why is there black anti-Semitism? And this goes back to, and this will get us to the Baldwin essay. You remember I said Jews open stores and rent in black neighborhoods. They rent out to blacks, which other whites would not do. What this means from the black community perspective is the face of whiteness are the Jews. Because the Jews are in the dominant position there. They own the stores, the blacks buy from them. They own the property, the blacks rent from them. They hire people, blacks are employees. So from the Jewish perspective, you're actually working with the community. From the black perspective, you seem to be exploiters. So that's why you get a discourse going that Jews are actually not only white exploiters, but the worst of the white exploiters, even though they're not. So Baldwin, James Baldwin, when he writes this essay in the 1960s in the New York Times, as you said, it's called Negroes Are, I think the title is Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White. And he starts out by saying in the black community, it's we hate the grocer because who's Jewish. We hate the lender because he's Jewish. All these reasons for hating Jews. But then he goes on to say, well, we also don't like the teachers. Some are Jews or some are not. We don't like police. Most of them are not Jewish. All these other groups, which expanded the whiteness. Yeah. And then he goes on to say, the real problem is the Christian. That is, we are fighting we are fighting not Jews, but we are fighting whites who claim to be Christian. And in fact, funny you mention this because I wrote down a very powerful quote, which I'm going to fish out now, just to say what Baldwin actually says. He says, and this is a quote from that essay, "It is not the Jew who controls the American drama. It is the Christian. The Jew is playing in Harlem the role assigned him by Christians long ago. He is doing their dirty work." That is, he sees this as part of a long tradition of Jews doing the dirty work for white Christians. So what he says is that, what disappoints him about Jews is that they're doing the dirty work of the whites. And he's saying, if we blacks in the 1960s, or some of us blacks, are attacking you Jews, it's because you were working with the white Christians.
Actually, this is why I'm so glad to have this conversation. And I think that especially the work of many historians is so important to tell actually this kind of stories and to shed light on where certain discourses are coming from, to learn for our actions today, actually. And it's when you have a look to anti-Semitism in the US, it's often going back, for example, also to evangelist Christian views on how they read the Bible, for example, and how they mark Jewish people as the evil who killed Jesus or whatever. So you have also other religious contexts, for example, also in Islamic discourses that are working in a similar way. But it's very important to go back actually to history and understand why certain minorities are standing today against each other, even though it doesn't make any sense for their own security. And you mentioned at the beginning that there were 5 categories when
Yeah, 4 with a subcategory
four with
of
a
Hispanic.
category of Hispanic. And I went back to these forms when people would come and arrive in Ellis Island, for example, in New York, and they had this form apparently, and you could tick a lot of options. You could tick Northern Italian, Southern Italian, Irish. You could tick Slavic, for example, or Scandinavian, German. And at one point, and this is like emphasizing how whiteness is constructed, someone in the US government or like some lobby groups who wanted to strengthen the US economy, they decided that we don't have this, we don't need this kind of economy, this kind of categories, because it's actually weakening the backbone of our economy, exploitation of Black people. And they didn't think about the Jews coming, for example, from Eastern Europe. That was not important for them. So this is why it's very important to go back to the history and understand why it doesn't make sense to be anti-Semitic and Black or racist and Jewish at the same time.
It's hurting both groups. I mean, both groups need each other, and it's. I mean, that having been said, already by the 1990s, you had very important spokespeople for African Americans like Henry Louis Gates or Cornel West, decrying Black anti-Semitism. I mean, Cornel West thought it was self-destructive of Blacks to be anti-Semitic. And Henry Louis Gates in the 1990s saying that actually it was a ploy by radical Black groups, Black nationalists, who want to destroy the Black-White alliance. And the best way to destroy the Black-White alliance is to attack Jews. And so that there's in the Black community too, there's a recognition about how self-destructive this is. Now, that having been said, there's also, of course, anti-Black racism among some Jews. And so both sides have to overcome these animosities because, as I said, they're both facing, whether they know it or not, this double-barreled shotgun.
Exactly.
From
By
white
listening
supremacy.
actually the stories that you just mentioned, or actually by deconstructing white supremacist ideology. Another good example is from now the German perspective or the European perspective, that tale of, for example, I spoke about Hungary, that George Soros, who is a very wealthy man here in the US from Hungarian Jewish descent, is having that plan to bring all those Muslim refugees to Europe to take over. But there you can see that this kind of white supremacy worldview actually sees again the ultimative other in the Jew. And the Muslims are just like the instruments. And therefore, when I listen to this kind of fairy tale, actually, I wonder why you would find something like anti-Semitism in Muslim or brown communities in Europe. We need to understand that actually we are targeted alongside Jewish communities, and that the main problem is, I think, for a lot of people, the conflict in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine. This is like overshadowing a lot of discussions, because a lot of people are very emotional, even though they are not involved at all. But at the same time, it's your life insurance in Europe, but also in the US, is to stand together and take care of each other. And this is like, I hope, the main message that we can also understand from your research, or from my perspective, or from the discussion that we will hopefully have after this.
I was hoping, to learn more about your perspective.
Yeah.
Because, you've written 2 books about, being white, or whiteness rather, not being yourself white, but about whiteness and the function of whiteness in Germany. And they're both fascinating books. And what I find especially fascinating is that the category of whiteness has always defined the United States, but it's relatively new to Europe. That is, of course, you've got this, Europe colonized the world, European nations, in the last half of the 19th century, early 20th century. And so there was this general discourse of whiteness. We are the white peoples who have a right to take over the world. But it really didn't impact European societies because there were no people of color in Europe. They were out there in the colonies. It's only a post-colonial issue. It only becomes an issue in post-colonial times where people of color actually moved to Europe in great numbers. And then whiteness isn't something abstract, but it becomes more real for people who are unhappy about these people of color coming to Europe. At least that's the way I see it. So it's a relatively late development in Europe. It's always been there in the United States because slavery's always been there in the United States. But that was just my impression. What's your impression about the difference between whiteness in Europe and whiteness in the United States?
First of all, from my perspective, it's always very important for me to mention that there is a connection, of course, between the history in the US and the history in Europe. Because white people, they didn't come from the moon here. They came from Rheinland-Pfalz, actually. Then some of their grandsons became eventually the president named Donald Trump. So there is a connection, actually, because a lot of white Germans, they would try to talk about, like, you know, the US as something over there. Yeah, we are fascinated, we look at it, but we have nothing to do with it. That's not true. And then you're right by mentioning that there is like a colonial and post-colonial narrative to how we deal with whiteness in Europe. Actually, before non-white immigrants came to France, for example, or to the UK or to Germany from the former colonies, Europe went to them and occupied them or told them this is actually Europe. Happened in Algeria. The French, they went there and they're like, okay, this is Europe. You're not as equal as we are as white people. La blancheté, actually, they were also using this kind of categories, but they were very, because they were involved, of course, also in the slavery economy, they were trying to make sense out of what they were doing. So I grew up partially also in Morocco and had to think and deconstruct a lot to understand that the French colonizer there tried to establish a kind of a hierarchy to tell, for example, brown North Africans that they are better than black Africans, to just make it easier for them to argue why they are colonizing, for example, different parts of Africa in a different way. And you can see this kind of thinking still alive within different communities. And then now in France, talking about Germany, because a lot of Germans, they don't want to talk about colonialism because we never had that kind of thing going on, which is actually shocking for some people when new-ish authors in the mainstream, at least, they try to explain that, of course, there was exploitation and colonialism also from the German state, that for a lot of people in Germany, it's actually difficult to understand why someone like me is talking about whiteness, because it's like the classic, they don't see color anyway, you know? But then it's something like, oh, this is like a category that makes sense in the US, but not for us. Yet you would have similar dynamics within police forces and the problem with police brutality. Like a lot of white Germans, they were shocked after the lynching of George Floyd. But they were shocked when a lot of black people, they wanted to talk about black people dying because of police brutality in Germany. They're like, no, we don't have this actually. So this is why I try in my work to translate actually the knowledge production here in the US to a German discourse, because we cannot have a copy-paste thing going on. It's not working one-on-one for what we are experiencing in Germany. But we certainly need also a critical discourse dismantling white privilege, talking about the positionality of Jewish communities, for example, and trying to build an alliance or solidarity between different communities in pointing out that this post-colonial dynamics are shaping our lives, actually, which is at the same time, as I said, shocking for a lot of people. So I get a lot of a lot of angry messages.
And what I would add to your comments, since we're talking about Germany, and again, this is something that a number of Germans don't like to hear, is what's standing behind this and still active subconsciously is Nazi ideology.
Yes.
Because let's look at what the Nazis said. I mean, they talked about white races, but they talked mainly about Aryan races.
Yeah.
So their emphasis was upon Aryans against Jews. That was the center of Nazi discourse. But it also, just like the French in Algeria or in Africa, the Nazis had a whole hierarchy of what they considered races and peoples. And so what you have coming together in Nazi ideology is both a conception of whiteness against people of color and of Aryans against Jews. And so this is a coming together.
Yes.
Of anti-people of color and anti-Semitism in the worst, most murderous ideology that the world has known in terms of racism. And so let me put it this way. A lot of people have trouble with the notion Deutsche mit Migrationshintergrund, because what that implies is that even if you're like born third generation in Germany, that Bio-Deutsche, Aryans, whatever you want to call them, think that you're not fully part of the community, because the assumption is that because you had a grandfather from another part of the world, that somehow influences the way you think and feel. Well, to counter that, some people propose that those who are not Deutsche mit Migrationshintergrund should be called Deutsche mit Nazi-Hintergrund, because they had grandparents, great-grandparents who lived in the Third Reich, and that too, consciously or unconsciously, influences them, just as supposedly this grandfather or great-grandfather who came from abroad that influences them. So it's a good way of countering this whole notion of, if you can talk about Deutsche mit Migrationshintergrund, you should be able to talk about everybody else being a Deutsche mit Nazi-Hintergrund. Because the Third Reich ideology, that's still there. That's still there, and people don't realize it. You can be as Antifa as you want, but it's still ghosting around.
Also because a lot of white Germans, they are still afraid or not looking into their family histories. It's like what I always say when I have, for example, a reading is that a person cannot take responsibility for what the grandfather did, of course, but you need to actually know where you're coming from and your education you go through. When I try to talk about continuities after 45, a lot of political decision makers or people in media, they are very, very angry at me, because for a lot of Germans, the horror actually stopped on 45, and then everybody lived happy and in peace. This is why there is also this irony when, I don't know how you think about it, but when I hear this image of the Christian-Jewish Abendland, which is trying to portray that Christianity and Judaism is actually one category and all the others, they belong to the other category that some people, they use that to say indirectly, we don't like this, mit Migrationshintergrund people. And at the same time, listening and reading about the construction of Aryan and Jewish, because that is what Nazi Germany actually tried to establish, and is unfortunately still very powerful today. That this romanticized way of looking at the Jewish minority in Germany is actually totally against historical facts, what Jews have had and have to suffer in Germany.
I mean, let's be honest about it. Jews are less than 0.1% of the German population. And yet, these surveys of German attitudes say at least 20% of Germans have anti-Semitic attitudes. So what does this mean concretely? If you're walking down the street in a big city in Germany, every 1,000th person is going to be Jewish, but every 5th person is going to be anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of the situation. And so you can talk as much as you want about, Jüdisch Christlich and saying we're friendly to Germans, but that just that has sunk into the majority of the German population, but there's still a large resistance to it. And, as you know well, this talk about Jüdisch Christlich Abendland, that is deployed against Muslims. And most members of the Jewish community say, leave us Jews out of it.
Yeah.
That is, we don't want to be part of an anti-Muslim discourse, because we know whatever happens to Muslims can happen to us Jews, and that's why Muslims should realize too, whatever happens to Jews can happen to Muslims within the European context. And the circumcision debate was a classic example. I mean, theologically and in terms of practice, Jews and Muslims have a lot more in common than Jews have with Christians or Muslims have with Christians. Among the Abrahamic, we could have another discussion about this, because this is getting another dimension. But among the 3 Abrahamic religions, Jews and Muslims are much closer. Christianity is the outlier.
Fun fact, when I was in Israel, Palestine, actually, a lot of people, they thought I am Jewish because, I can say the so it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm some Jew from New York.
Yeah.
Actually, this debate, I think, is just starting, and I hope that there will be a conversation between different communities and minorities. Therefore, I thank you so much, Peter, for your thoughts and for your work, actually, and I hope that we will come together soon again to have more exchange and work on how to build alliances.
Thank you very much, Mo. I've very much enjoyed this conversation, and I do hope we can continue it as well.
Thank you. And see you soon, hopefully, and bye-bye from the Thomas Mann House.